Well, good evening, ladies and gentlemen. I'm Colonel Retired David Gray. I'm the Executive Director here at the Center for Leadership and Ethics, and I want to welcome you to tonight's debate. We're very proud to partner with the Steamboat Institute to kick off their 2025-2026 Campus Liberty Tour debates. Now, I'd like to thank up front Professor Jonathan Turley, Professor Daniel Farbman, and Miss Kaylee McGee-White for traveling quite a distance to be with here tonight to explore tonight's topic. Now, every year, the center designates a theme that addresses a topic of national importance, and we use that theme to guide our programming. This year's theme is American values. And we chose that theme to recognize our upcoming 250th anniversary of the country next July. Now, given the current level of political discord and politically motivated violence in recent months, this couldn't be a more germane topic. So tonight's topic addresses the United States in a constitutional crisis? And we'll look at some of those issues that are causing some of this discord. Now, ladies and gentlemen, let me be crystal clear. The purpose of tonight's gathering is to role model the proper way Americans should deal with opposing ideas by engaging in the marketplace of competing ideas with facts, with persuasion, and with civility. Now, at the end of the evening, we're probably not all going to agree with each other. But what we are going to do is we're going to turn to our neighbors left and right, despite disagreements, and we're going to shake their hand as fellow Americans. That's the way, the proper way for Americans to debate these controversial issues. Now, to build on that idea, it is now my great pleasure to introduce Mr. Daniel Wagner, who is Steamboat's director of the Campus Liberty Tour. Ladies and gentlemen, please give Daniel a warm VMI welcome.
Thank you, Colonel Gray, and thanks to the Center for Leadership and Ethics for co-hosting tonight's debate with Steamboat Institute. It's great to be back on the VMI campus. We had an amazing debate here last year with Vivek Ramaswamy and John Bolton, and we have another compelling program for you tonight. Thanks to all of you for coming out tonight, and thanks also to our live stream audience who's watching from all over the country. Steamboat Institute was founded in 2008 in Steamboat Springs, Colorado, for the purpose of educating people about America's first principles and fostering an appreciation of the freedom we enjoy as Americans. We have hosted dozens of debates on college campuses across America for the past 7.5 years. Why debates? Because civil debate and discourse, not violence, are the key to solving our problems. When we stop talking to each other, bad things happen. Tonight, we are kicking off our fall Campus Liberty Tour, which will feature 6 debates in 7 weeks. Our upcoming debates include October 8th at Cornell University in Ithaca, New York, on whether American global dominance is the best defense against tyranny and evil. October 15th at the University of Texas in Austin on whether tariffs are beneficial to our economy. October 28th will be at the University of Maryland, debating the question whether government should ban all diversity, equity, and inclusion programs. On November 4th at Grand Canyon University in Phoenix on whether artificial intelligence will do more harm than good. And finally, on November 13th at the University of Colorado in Colorado Springs on whether capitalism is superior to socialism in promoting human flourishing. You can view the full debate schedule, including topics and speakers, at steamboatinstitute.org, and be sure to pick up one of the flyers on our table that we have outside this evening. With all of our debates, you can register to watch live from anywhere in the country. Just go to steamboatinstitute.org and sign up for a free viewing link. get some friends together, watch our debate, and then continue the conversation with your own debate. And of course, all of our previous debates are available for viewing on Steamboat Institute's YouTube channel. As a nonprofit, nonpartisan organization, Steamboat Institute relies on the support of many generous individuals and foundations to bring programs such as tonight's debate to audiences across the country. I would like to extend a special thank you to our major sponsors, the Adolph Coors Foundation, the Diana Davis Spencer Foundation, the Line and Harry Bradley Foundation, Jack Roth Charitable Foundation, Arthur N. Roop Foundation, and Bruce and Marcy Benson for their support, which has allowed us to expand this program to more than 30 college campuses across America. As we approach the 250th anniversary of the founding of our nation, many people are claiming that America is experiencing a constitutional crisis. Since our Constitution was signed in 1787, how has it stood for all these years, and why do many now believe it is in crisis? Are we truly at the brink of a national reckoning, or is this merely another fault line in our political divisions? Tonight's program will examine this important question with a fair and balanced debate on the following resolution. Be it resolved, the U.S. is experiencing a constitutional crisis. We invite all of our audience members to respond with your view on this resolution, either agree, disagree, or undecided, before the debate begins using the QR code that we provided to you earlier. I see some of you already started. We will then ask your opinion again after the debate is over to see if your opinions have changed. Right? And if you haven't received that card tonight, we can have someone come down and give it to you. Or if a neighbor doesn't have it, we can maybe just help each other out and pass it to them so everybody can vote. Now it's my great pleasure to introduce our speakers and moderator for this evening. So please help me in welcoming them to the stage. Arguing the affirmative on tonight's resolution is Daniel Farbman, Associate Professor at Boston College Law School, where he has been teaching classes on constitutional law since 2017. For 3 years prior to joining BC Law, he was a lecturer at Harvard Law School. Farbman's work has been published in the California Law Review, Cardozo Law Review, Fordham Law Review, North Carolina Law Review, Vanderbilt Law Review, and Yale Journal of Law and Humanities. After graduating from Amherst College in 2001, Professor Farbman spent a few years in New York City trying and failing to make it as a professional actor before he enrolled at Harvard Law School, graduating in 2007. Following graduation, he began a Skadden Fellowship at Advancement Project in Washington, D.C., where he worked with community organizers around the country on grassroots efforts to fight racial injustice in public education. After leaving practice, Farbman pursued a PhD in American Studies at Harvard University. Please give a warm welcome to Professor Daniel Farbman. Arguing the negative on tonight's resolution is Jonathan Turley, a nationally recognized legal scholar who has written extensively in areas ranging from constitutional law to legal theory to tort law. Professor Turley joined the George Washington University Law faculty in 1990. He is the founder and executive director of the Project for Older Prisoners and has written more than 36 academic articles that have appeared in a variety of leading law journals, including those of Cornell, Duke, Georgetown, Harvard, and Northwestern universities, among others. Professor Turley has served as counsel in some of the most notable cases in the last 2 decades, including a variety of national security and terrorism cases, and has been ranked as one of the top 10 lawyers handling military cases. Professor Turley is a member of the USA Today Board of Contributors. More than 400 of his articles on legal and policy issues regularly appear in national newspapers. He has also worked as a legal analyst for CBS, NBC, and Fox News. And just 2 weeks ago, he was the featured Constitution Day speaker at the annual Constitution Day celebration held in our home state of Colorado in beautiful Grand Lake. Please give a warm welcome to Professor Jonathan Turley. And last, but certainly not least, our moderator for this evening's debate is Kaylee McGee-White, Editor-in-Chief of Independent Women's Features. Kaylee was awarded Steamboat Institute's Blankley Fellowship for Rising Young Journalists in 2023. Kaylee previously served as the Restoring America editor at the Washington Examiner and is now a Fox News contributor. She graduated from Hillsdale College with degrees in politics and journalism. And with that, I'll turn it over to our moderator, Kaylee, to kick us off.
Well, thank you so much. And thank you to all of you for being here. We're really looking forward to this conversation. I would like to just remind everyone that you are able to submit questions for our two panelists throughout this debate. So towards the end of our conversation, we will be going through some of those questions and having them answer them. So for our opening statements, Professor Fredman, would you like to start?
Hello, everybody. It's great to be here. I want to thank the Steamboat Institute. I want to thank VMI. I want to thank Kaylee and Professor Turley for joining us tonight and engaging in this. I guess I want to start with one disclaimer, which is that I hope that I convince you of some things tonight, but I hope more that you come with an open mind and leave with an opener mind. I'm not sure that debate in its sort of classic binary sense is the most useful way of talking to each other always. I think that our polarization has made us stupider by and large. And I think sometimes when we think of debate as a binary, who wins, who loses, owning the opponents, we can make ourselves stupider rather than learning things. So I hope tonight's the night when we can learn things together. At least that's one of the reasons I'm here and why I'm glad to be here. So let me just begin with a basic premise, right? Premise is that we are in a moment of civic and political crisis. It's hard to imagine that many of you in the audience disagree with this statement, at least on some form. I think we're experiencing political instability, whatever that means to you, whatever side of the aisle you identify with. The second piece of this premise is that the Constitution is the thing that structures our civic and political life. It is the fundamental law that structures our political life, our legal structure. The third piece of that premise is that the things that the Constitution is supposed to do, that's supposed to protect, are precisely the things that are least stable in this moment of civic and political crisis. I'll say more about that in a minute. Now, you might say, and if possible, that Professor Turley might say, that this doesn't mean we're in a constitutional crisis. Well, we could have a relatively boring conversation about precisely what the definition of a constitutional crisis is. To me, it seems evident that we are in a political and civic crisis and that it has a lot to do with our Constitution and the failure of our Constitution to get us out of that crisis by itself. To me, that meets the threshold of constitutional crisis, but we can talk about that, obviously. So let me just make this argument to you in a little bit more depth before they kick me off the stage. The first point to make is that I'm going to lay out some things that I think are relatively uncontroversially things we want from our Constitution. And I think they're things we want from our Constitution, and they're rooted in the history of the Constitution. So here they are. Political stability, democracy, some form of checks and balances, whether you want to call it separation of powers or some form of checks and balances, and finally, a protection of individual rights. I think these are uncontroversially things that we want from our Constitution. They're the things the Constitution was written to protect for us. Well, let's just go through them one by one. Political stability. How's that going for us right now? How stable do we feel like our politics are? How anxious are we about political violence? How anxious are we about our disagreements spilling over into incommensurable conflict with each other as opposed to civil discourse? So political stability is something we don't have right now and we would like more of. Well, so Madison's great compromise when he was writing the Constitution was to bring together this idea of political stability with democratic accountability, with democratic legitimacy. Well, I think there's a lot of people on both sides of the aisle right now who are anxious about whether or not we have a functioning, democratically legitimate system. Now, there are some people who seem not to like the idea of democracy in the first place. There are other people who distrust the result of elections. There's a lot of people who distrust the result of the 2020 elections. There's also a lot of people right now who are anxious about whether we will have free and fair elections in upcoming elections. Now, you might disagree about whether they're factually right or wrong, but that anxiety is something that's really troubling and at the root of our constitutional order troubling. If we can't have faith in democracy, and we can't have the political stability that comes from democratic legitimacy. All right, separation of powers. I'll just say this quickly. I don't think descriptively Congress right now feels empowered to step in and be a check against executive power. We can talk about more examples about that as we go through the debate. I'll just give you one very tiny example, which is the renaming by the executive as the Department of War. Congress didn't name it that, but the president and the administration knows that Congress won't go back and change the name. Congress is essentially not empowered to have any say in a thing that they had a say over. And there's all kinds of ways in which this is true of Congress. I think you could say the same thing about the courts. I'm sure we'll talk more about the courts. I'll leave that for now, but I hope we'll talk more about it. And then finally, let me just say quickly about individual rights. And and again, I hope we talk more about this. How secure do we feel like our First Amendment rights are with each other right now? How secure do we feel, either whether it's in this administration or the past one, about First Amendment rights? How secure do we feel about our Fourth Amendment rights, about being arrested without a warrant, about due process before being sent out of the country? How secure do we feel about these individual rights? I think that's a real question that we have to grapple with. So with that, I'll stop. I'm at time, and I look forward to talking about all this much more.
Thank you very much. I want to thank VMI and Steamboat Institute. I wanted to thank my friend Daniel and Kaylee for making this possible. I was speaking recently in Prague about my new book, which is subtitled Free Speech in an Age of Rage. When, before my speech, I was told about my friend Charlie Kirk being assassinated. We weren't close friends, but I knew him and I liked him a great deal. And when you write about an age of rage, the terrible thing is, as shocked as you are, you're not a bit surprised. The fact is, this isn't our first age of rage. This country was born in rage. That's what the Boston Tea Party was. It's not rage rhetoric that is the problem. It's how we respond to it. What happened to Charlie, it's an escalation. What's happening today, right now, is a de-escalation. It is what Charlie wanted. He wanted a debate. So let's give him one. Now, the fact is, we are not in a constitutional crisis. We're in a crisis of faith. Law professors are questioning the Constitution as whether it's still suitable. You heard some of that just now. It's a strange phenomenon among law professors. We're like priests who have lost their faith but kept their frocks. But the fact is, the Constitution of the United States wasn't just written for times like this. It was written in a time like this. That's what the Alien Sedition Acts were. John Adams wanted to kill his opponents. He arrested them. They were to be sentenced to death. There's nothing new about it, and it's a dangerous conceit that every generation has, that your problems are so unique, so insurmountable, that you have to change the rules, that the problem is with the Constitution, not in ourselves. The fact is, this is a Constitution that was designed to last. We have the most stable and successful constitutional system in the history of the world. It's not pretty. If you want to read a truly beautiful Constitution, read one of the French constitutions. They had a lot of practice because they failed so often. And those are poetic constitutions. Our Constitution was written by a dweeb. I'm a Madisonian scholar, but I got to tell you, he was a wonk. But he designed something that was beautiful in its simplicity. The fact is, the greatest testament to his work is we're still here after everything we've been through. Even moments like Charlie Kirk's death, we're still here and we're still talking. And people who say it's a constitutional crisis are ignoring the obvious. Courts are ruling against President Trump when he's wrong. And he has been wrong. And I've criticized him when he's been wrong. And they have ruled for him when he's been right. Every indication is that this system is functioning not just well, but brilliantly. On January 6th, there was a disgraceful attack upon the United States Capitol. That riot was a disgrace. It was a desecration of our constitutional process. But the Congress came together. The parties came together. They certified a new president. The courts continue to work. That's our legacy. Don't confuse a crisis of faith with a constitutional crisis. The greatest legacy we have is that Constitution, and it's a leap of faith, but it's not an article of faith between us and the government. It's a covenant of faith with each other. That's what the Constitution was. We agreed that we'd live by the rules, and we have for all these years. I have a book coming out called Rage in the Republic, and it asks what the future of the American democracy is. And the greatest threat that we face is the threat within us. It's the doubt of who we are. This Constitution defines us as a people. If we have faith in it, we can withstand what's coming the 21st century, which is a challenge like we've never faced before. But the thing about the United States Constitution, as Benjamin Franklin said, is it's ours if we can keep it. And we have kept it. And I have no doubt that this generation will keep it, because we'll keep the faith. We know what problems we have today are our problems, not our constitutions. Thank you very much.
Well, thank you both. So for my first question, I want to start by establishing a sort of baseline here. How would you both define a constitutional crisis, and how would you distinguish that from a mere political dispute? Professor Berman, first.
Sure. Well, I think one thing that I think maybe this is a useful question, so I appreciate it, because I think that it's going to help figure out where Professor Turley and I disagree. I think one thing I just want to say at the outset is I'm a little puzzled by the idea that a constitutional crisis means the Constitution is ending. The way that I see it, and I'm a historian, the way that I think about history is that a constitutional crisis can be a moment in which our Constitution is transformed. It can be a moment in which our Constitution comes under stress, and in its previous incarnation is no longer serviceable to us. So a classic example of this would be the Constitution before 1867 permitted slavery. It had to be changed. It could no longer permit slavery in this country. It was no longer possible to imagine a founding document, a foundational document that permitted slavery. That was a crisis of the constitutional order. And so it had to be changed. Now, did that actually eviscerate the Constitution? No, it was an amendment that changed the Constitution. You could make the argument, and I suppose maybe if this is the argument, we may not disagree, that because the Constitution survived that moment of crisis, it was not really a crisis. But to me, if we have a crisis, a political crisis, a civic crisis, and the Constitution, as it's currently structured, by itself, the status quo way that it's being used is not up to meeting that crisis, then the people, we, those of us in this room, are charged with either rethinking, remaking the Constitution to meet that crisis, or doing something else. To me, it's still a crisis if that moment comes upon us. And I guess my argument would be that this feels like one of those moments when our traditional settled ideas of how things work and the kind of faith others will take care of this for us feels less true than it's been for a long time. And if that's true, then it is a crisis, and that crisis is constitutional. It doesn't mean it's the end of the Constitution. That's not my argument. But it does mean that it's a crisis that we have to deal with, and we can't just hope the Constitution by itself will deal with it while we go and watch the Red Sox game, which is what I wish I was doing right now, to be totally honest with you. As much as I'm happy to be here with you, it pains me to be missing the game.
I actually had the closest I've come to a constitutional crisis was 2 days ago when I had tickets to the Cubs playoffs and realized I was going to be here. And I have to say, I was fortunate I did not have to choose between the Cubs playoffs and defending the Constitution. I'm not too sure I'm strong enough for that test yet. But the Cubs did win today, and so I feel like there was something divine in that. Here's my problem with what Daniel said. No, we're not in a constitutional crisis. It's a strange thing when people say, look, the Constitution, why do we have to just wait to see if it works? Well, because it's worked for 2 centuries. And also the idea that it's a crisis because it's not doing something that you want. Many of my colleagues and friends on the other side didn't say there was a constitutional crisis when Barack Obama announced his kill list policy, that he could kill any American citizen anywhere at any time based on his sole decision that they were a national security risk. And then he vaporized an American citizen, and then he vaporized that citizen's son 2 days later. I didn't see any of my colleagues standing up saying, oh my God, a constitutional crisis. I didn't see people saying constitutional crisis when Barack Obama went in his State of the Union in 2014 and said, you have failed to pass immigration environmental laws that I wanted, so I'm now going to go at it on my own. I'm going to act unilaterally to do all of that. I didn't see all my friends on the other side saying, my God, this is a constitutional crisis. Suddenly we're in a constitutional crisis because democracy hasn't worked the way some people wanted it to. The last election was a shock for many people. They didn't agree that there was a constitutional crisis. Remember the last election, there was a mantra that democracy was going to die. Remember that? It was like everyone was saying, democracy will be dead. EKG is failing. It'll be flatlining soon after Trump takes the oath of office. And people didn't buy it. Why? Because they had faith. They had faith in this Constitution. And when you see people complaining about, well, it's just not working, do you feel represented? A lot of people do feel represented. That's why they elected this guy. Okay, that was the result of a democratic election. And many of the people on the other side saying it's constitutional crisis were the same people that were arguing that Trump should be kept off a ballot of an election that he ended up winning, and also argued that 120 other Republicans should be off the ballot to do ballot cleansing. The same Save Democracy advocates were arguing for ballot cleansing, what you see in places like Iran. So there is a bias here. What I just don't see is, where is the evidence that the Constitution is failing? What people cite is that the political system is not doing what they want it to do. I don't think that a dispute over whether we call it the Department of Defense or the Department of War is a constitutional crisis. And I don't think it represents that. And so it's not that we don't have a political crisis. And I respect my friend Daniel, and I know that he has a good faith belief in this, that he has these concerns. But when you talk about, for example, slavery, the Constitution worked because part of the Constitution says we can amend the Constitution. The problem is that the people on the other side don't want to amend the Constitution, right? They want to create a state in DC without a constitutional amendment. They want to pack the Supreme Court. I'm not saying they, meaning Daniel here. I'm saying that people on the other side. They want to pack the Supreme Court to give an instant liberal majority. You people like, you've professors like Mark Tushnet at Harvard saying that Biden should just ignore decisions that he doesn't agree with from the Supreme Court. But none of that's viewed as begging for a constitutional crisis. That's all viewed as somehow rehabilitative of a constitutional system that's broken. I don't see any evidence this constitutional system is broken. The closest we have gotten to a constitutional crisis, one is, I would say, Abraham Lincoln suspending habeas corpus was a very significant crisis because it was not reversed. And the Supreme Court did not go further on that. They did confront him on it. But part of that was it sort of got lost because of the war going on. I'm really not too sure how it would have turned out if a couple of factors weren't at play. But that was a crisis. But we have had presidents confront Congress repeatedly and defy Congress. This isn't the first president that has stretched presidential authority. But those were not called constitutional crisis by a lot of my friends, but it is now. And the question is why?
So I want to turn to some current events, and I want to talk about some of these tensions that both of you have mentioned. And since we're at a military institute, it feels fitting to start with a question about whether the President Trump, is abusing his executive power by deploying the National Guard to police certain cities in blue states. We know that Governor Gavin Newsom has filed a lawsuit against the Trump administration over that deployment. Professor Turley, if you'd like to weigh in on this first.
Well, this depends on the circumstance. In D.C., where the National Guard were deployed, he was completely within his rights to do so. It was completely legal. D.C. is a federal enclave. He had a right to call out the National Guard. He's also going to call out the National Guard in places like Louisiana. It's perfectly legal. The governor there has invited the National Guard deployment. It gets much more difficult legally when governors in California, Illinois, Wisconsin do not agree to the deployment of National Guard troops. And I think that there is a serious question there as to whether he can do it. That will be quickly sorted out in court. We've already had a couple of decisions. Another example of how our system works. They went to court, there were decisions, the administrations, and by the way, the Trump in the first term of President Trump, which I covered, he uniformly complied with rulings that went against him. He has almost uniformly done that here. The only reason I don't say he's uniformly done it is there was the Garcia case where there was a violation of a court order, but he was then returned to the United States. But otherwise, the administration has complied with orders because there's a respect for the constitutional system. So the National Guard deployment is going to have to be sorted out in those states. But by the way, it doesn't matter. He can flood the zone with federal officers. He can flood them with ICE officers, FBI officers, and there's not a thing that the governor or the mayors can do about that. It's just the use of National Guard troops when the governor is opposing that raises a legitimate legal question.
So I think there's a couple things here that are worth untangling. One is that even if it's true that President Trump is abiding by the legal decisions that have been made. So for instance, in California, there was a judge who said this violates the Constitution and the Posse Comitatus Act. This deployment was illegal. He's still threatening to do it again. And so that's one thing, is that even if it's true that he abides by a specific legal order, if you followed the news today, he explicitly talked about deploying not just the National Guard, but in fact, federal troops to American cities, specifically democratically controlled American cities. That doesn't sound to me like a president who's been chastened by a legitimate constitutional ruling. Moreover, if you think about what actually happened in Los Angeles, is the National Guard was deployed. And then by the time it was gone, when the case finally moved through the courts, it was found to have been unconstitutional. I don't think it's particularly puzzling or difficult a legal question to see whether it's okay to deploy National Guard troops to a state without the governor's permission. Moreover, if you think about the underlying constitutional principles, and the Third Amendment barely gets any love, we'll give it some love here. The Third Amendment protects all of us from having to quarter soldiers in our houses, right? One of the very core reasons why that was true was because of an anxiety about a standing army on American soil. That's one of the core anxieties that animated the people writing the Constitution. If the president, maybe he will abide by every order that is made to say you can't have federal troops in American cities, but he's still threatening to do it over and over and over again. And my point is that the courts don't have any mechanism. If he one time decides, I'm not going to abide by this decision, we're over the leg, because there's no mechanism the courts have to stop him from doing it. So it may be that we can have faith that he will abide by every decision. It doesn't seem to be structuring his behavior right now. And if it's not structuring his behavior, it's actually structuring our behavior, right? So in the context of this, the actual fear that federal troops might come into the city of Boston is going to change. It's going to chill. It's going to structure the way that people live in Boston, the way that the city government of Boston works, the way that the state government of Massachusetts works. That by itself is a shadow of constitutional violation that's happening in spite of, I think, relatively clear legal precedent and now clear legal decisions saying, don't do that. And so I think we have to ask the question, if the Constitution, if these rulings are not sufficient to stop the president from continuing to make these threats, how protected do we feel by the court's decisions in that instance?
I'd like to follow up because first of all, just as a litigator, I don't understand when you say there's no ability for us to stop the president from doing something. There are injunctions, there are preliminary injunctions, there are court orders, and they have complied with them. Now, yes, some presidents push this too far. They've done it in the past. Franklin Delano Roosevelt told the Supreme Court in the German saboteur case in World War II that if they proceeded to say that they have due process, he was going to take them out and shoot them. He told that to the Supreme Court. Jackson told the Supreme Court that your decision on states with involving Indian rights was meaningless, essentially, because it wouldn't be enforced. We've had these moments where presidents have done it. When Joe Biden admitted on the national moratorium on evictions, admitted that his own White House counsel and every attorney he spoke to said, you do not have authority to impose a national moratorium on evictions. He said there was one professor, Larry Tribe, who told him he could do it. And he ignored his own White House counsel and every attorney he spoke to and went ahead admitting that they all said it was probably unconstitutional. No one that I know of on the other side said, my God, this is the rise of authoritarianism. This is a president. Obviously, the system is not working because he had previously been told this was unconstitutional, including court decisions, and he was still doing it. It doesn't work that way. Yes, presidents can resist, and courts issue these orders, but there's a strange thing about it. And that is when Supreme Courts, unlike what President Jackson suggested, that Supreme Courts don't need an army because they have us. Presidents know that it's in our DNA. Yes, presidents will game the system. They will try to get as much as they can done before order comes down. But then there are attorneys like us that can give preliminary injunctions that bind them. And the Supreme Court, by the way, has ruled against the president, including his own nominees, and they have complied. Now, does that happen instantaneously? No. But the suggestion that, because there is this slippage, because there is this delay, the constitutional system is failing, I don't understand how that tracks with reality.
Can I just follow up really quickly? I do think that there's an important distinction here in the sense that the specific facts of this instance that we're talking about with military deployments to American cities, the president has been told by a court, if we take this chastening to be a legitimate chastening, that this is not allowed. And it doesn't seem to have made him stop any of his behavior. I guess to me, there's one thing which is the specific disobeying of an order. There's another thing which is the basically just disregarding of the order's obvious application in other instances. And so I'm not saying the president will disobey a direct order. I'm saying that a lot of people fear that he may. And that fear delegitimizes, it undermines the work the Constitution is supposed to do when people legitimately are anxious about whether or not the president is going to or not going to abide by a court order. And I'll just say one more thing. It is true that of course, Professor Turley's right about the way in which the court has, generally speaking, been listened to. It's also true that the court has historically been extremely cautious about coming to these confrontations. So the most famous case, the case of Marbury versus Madison, this most famous case when the court announces its ability to say what the law is. Justice Marshall knew that if he actually ruled against President Jefferson, Jefferson might say, get out of here. We don't care what you say. Court doesn't matter to us. So he ruled for Jefferson while at the same time telling everybody that he had all this power. I could give you more examples of this. We could talk about Korematsu. We could talk about many other moments when the court has sought to avoid these kinds of confrontations. And I would just suggest to you that it's perfectly possible to imagine the court being worried about those confrontations, increasingly worried because of the rhetoric that comes out of the executive branch, And that might be shaping the court's ability to stand as the kind of check we might want it to stand as if the court's afraid of those confrontations and afraid of what would happen if those confrontations happen.
So I want to stay on this train of thought. I think there are two branches of government in particular right now that are pushing the bounds of their authority. The first, as you mentioned, is President Trump. We know that the administration is attempting to exert even more control over the federal bureaucracy. There's a goal of maybe even overturning Humphrey's executor in the Supreme Court to that extent. And then you have the judiciary, which many would argue is also pushing the bounds of its authority, releasing hundreds of district court decisions in an effort to curtail the president's executive authority. Professor Turley, I'll start with you. How do you interpret both of these actions from the different branches, and do these amount to just strain on the Constitution or a genuine crisis of its functioning?
Well, I don't think it's a crisis, but it really is an excellent question because, we've seen all of these injunctions coming out of district courts around the country. I do think that some of those district court judges are far outside the navigational beacons of Article 3. I think that many of them have just been incredibly abusive of their power. But when it came to injunctions, this is not something new. Everyone keeps on saying, this Trump court or this conservative court is restricting lower court decisions. The Supreme Court, I cover the Supreme Court for over a decade. They have been absolutely insistent that trial judges have to stop national injunctions. You know who was one of the most critical? Justice Kagan. During the Obama administration, Kagan was livid and said that we cannot have trial judges issuing these national injunctions. You cannot have a workable system like this. Because what you have is over 600 judges. It is like being attacked by Lilliputians if you are a president of the United States. You have to run the table of over 600 judges and make sure that none of them object to you. Well, that's what Kagan was objecting to. So when you see the Supreme Court swatting down these trial courts, it's because this goes back years. Trial courts have been ignoring what they've been saying, and they're finally taking this seriously, and they're reversing these courts. I think many of these courts are insane about some of the things they've issued. I've agreed with some of them. I think that the Trump administration has gone too far in some areas. But the President of the United States has a right, after he ran on shrinking the government, to shrink government. If you really believe in democracy, then you believe in that. And the extent to which courts sort of micromanaged efforts to shrink the government, shrink the budget, I think went too far. There are some legitimate issues there. Money that has been appropriated by Congress, there's legitimate questions there. There is a federal law that has to be addressed there. But there's also a lot of these lines between Congress and the executive that have long been controversial, including the one that you mentioned, and whether you can have truly independent agencies in the executive branch. Those have long been controversial. It didn't start with this administration. So I do believe that that is another example of how a branch can exceed its authority. One thing about James Madison, and my students joke that I can't go 5 minutes without mentioning James Madison, which I guess I've proven in this debate a few times. But, the thing about James Madison is that when he created our constitutional system, or had a large part in it, the hottest thing at that time among intellectuals was Newtonian physics. That was the hottest thing. Everyone was talking about Newton and the laws of nature. Madison at Princeton, when he was a student, developed an entire constellation of hundreds of planets because he was fascinated by this. And in the Constitutional Convention, he talks in Newtonian terms about 3 equal branches locked in orbit, that you could get balanced by this competition, that each is jealous of its own authority, each is going to resist. Now, that means that it's a messy system. It means that you do have this resistance. You do have judges, legislators, presidents who try to exceed their authority. And that's when those checks and balances kick in. It's a natural part of the Madisonian system. It's not pretty, but it is part of that gravitational pull that keeps those three bodies in that fixed orbit.
So I guess I want to say a couple things. One is I just want to note this might also not be an area of disagreement, but I think it's a little bit of there's a slight pattern of suggesting that this is not the first time something has happened, that also Barack Obama did it, or also Joe Biden did it. I'm just not sure that's germane to the question that we're talking about here. If we're in a crisis, then the crisis could have started 10 years ago. In some ways, you might argue that the crisis actually began with congressional entrenchment against a lot of Obama's priorities. So I'm not sure that that changes the analysis of whether or not we're in a crisis, whether it's, so maybe the story is I'm infected with Trump derangement syndrome. And so it's only because of Trump that I think this, but that's actually not the way that I think. I'm not sure it's a fair characterization of many people who might agree with me politically. I think that this is a long-standing, Trump is at the end of a process that's been going on for quite some time. Let me just also speak in defense of the judiciary for a minute. There is not an option that you have if you're I clerked for a federal district court judge. There's not an option you have when a case comes before you. So let's take, for instance, the example of California, the case that came up about ICE agents basically racially profiling the people outside Home Depots, right? Deciding if you look like you might be an immigrant, we'll pull you in. Now, if you're the federal judge, that case comes before you. It's in fact very clear what the constitutional principles suggest about racial profiling. On this court's, especially with the recent affirmative case, this court's jurisprudence is crystal clear about whether or not you're allowed to consider race in any kind of governmental decision making. So when the court gets that case, and it's a class action, what is the court supposed to do? Are they supposed to say, okay, go ahead? They have to answer the question. And I think what you're seeing across the country is many more questions being asked of this nature. And the president simply not give money that's been congressionally appropriated? Can the president simply not give due process to people before sending them out of the country? Can the president simply not use warrants for arresting people on the streets? Can the president simply consider, can ICE just consider race as it's, these are questions that the courts have to answer. And if they rule that what's happening is unconstitutional, they have to issue an injunction against the practice. And if the practice is a national practice, it has to be a national injunction. Now, it's true that the Supreme Court will then eventually get to hear those cases. But I just want to note to you, on a couple of these instances, especially the instance of racial profiling in California, the Supreme Court, Justice Kavanaugh writes a concurrence that doesn't really give you much of an answer to why it's okay that this happened. The Supreme Court allows ICE to continue this practice without coming to a conclusion, without explaining why this deviation from its own extremely recent and clear jurisprudence is happening. So if you put yourself in the position of the next district court judge, where another similar case comes before them, they've got to answer the question. And the only tools they have before them are the court's jurisprudence, the court's rules. And now they're being told they also have to interpret the court's vague votes without fully reasoned opinions. It's a really difficult position to be in. And maybe judges get it wrong sometimes. Of course they get it wrong sometimes. They're human. But they're being forced to answer so many of these questions. And I think the reason why is that one of the core principles that I perceive in this administration is we don't care whether it's been considered illegal or not. We may have our own view of what's constitutional and what's not constitutional, but we don't care that the law is clearly goes the other way. We're going to do it and see what happens. And that's going to cause a flood of litigation. And that's going to cause the kind of chaos that I think we're seeing.
Before we move to some questions from the audience, I want to tackle one more current event, which is, as you might have known, the White House has released statements several times now announcing that it has attacked drug smugglers or people that they've alleged to be drug smugglers coming into the United States with the use of drones and other high-tech weaponry. So are these attacks, do they amount to unconstitutional acts of extrajudicial assassination without authorization from Congress first?
Putting aside the merits of the policy. I don't agree that we should be taking out boats regularly that we accused of smuggling drugs. That's a policy question. Legally, I think he does have the right to do it. I mean, the strange thing is all these people that are objecting to it didn't say a thing. Obama said he could vaporize an American citizen in the United States. He vaporized one outside the United States. Nobody said, my God, that's an extrajudicial killing. Where'd you get that authority? These are people that the president has defined as a national security threat outside the country. Presidents have been given a lot of leeway. Presidents have, in fact, ordered a great number of people killed outside of our borders on the basis of national security. I don't know of a law that would prevent him from doing that. Presidents have issued, cruise missile strikes and everything you can imagine in foreign countries based on the same national security determination. So as you're asking about a legal position, no, I don't think that the president is going to lose this one, because I don't see the precedent. I see a lot of precedent where they have used this authority in the past.
So I know we're short on time, but I just do want to respond in a couple of ways. One is this is a moment where it really isn't fair to lump me in with the nobody who objected to what Obama did. I did, and I know many people did. I don't think it's the case that there was wide acceptance of unregulated presidential use of force in that context. Now, there was political acceptance in some ways, but I just don't think that's a fair characterization of many people who share the beliefs about some of the things I do. I also just want to note to you, there actually is a really clear constitutional provision that does make this deeply problematic. And that is that Congress has the only and sole power to declare war. Now, we are way through the looking glass on that, right? We are way through the looking glass on whether or not Congress has abdicated its responsibility and its authority to actually regulate when we do and do not fire guns at people and shoot missiles at people. But I think this is a great reminder of the fact that we're through the looking glass. I don't think that means, because we've through the looking glass, this isn't a constitutional problem. I think this is a long-standing, deeply problematic constitutional problem that it's long since time we got our heads around. Because if this is the end point, that if you decide someone on a boat who might be a fisherman is a terrorist, you blow them up. That's precisely why Congress is supposed to have the power and not the president. And
So our first audience question is going to be on congressional authority too. So Professor Turley, you'll have a chance to respond. We've talked about how both the judicial and the executive branches are pushing the bounds of their constitutional limits, but the one branch of government that seems very content to sit back and not do that is Congress. Is it a constitutional crisis, or is it a matter of Congress not doing the job that the Constitution has ordered it to do?
No, I actually think that Congress is failing its duty, and it's done it for many, many years. When Obama went in his State of the Union and told Congress that he was going to completely circumvent it, that he was tired of not getting the legislation he wanted, the Democrats gave him a standing ovation. They were applauding their own obsolescence. They were delighted that he was saying, I'm going to make you a constitutional non-entity, and they clapped like seals. Now, is that good? No. Did Madison think that would happen? No, actually, I don't think he did. He thought that, frankly, ambition would fight ambition. So I'm a Madisonian scholar. I favor Congress in most fights with presidents. And I wish they were more aggressive, but I want to deal with something that Daniel said. Brother, if you can make that cat walk backwards on the declaration of war, I'll be right there with you. I don't remember a lot of people objecting when Bill Clinton was hitting Afghanistan and other countries, or every president in my lifetime has attacked other countries, killed foreigners that they declared to be national security risks. Now, do I like that? No, I haven't liked a president since James Madison. So, I'm totally with you. But if you're talking about precedent, that Congress has not declared wars, and presidents have exercised this authority of taking out ships from the 1800s that they consider to be national security risks. That is one of the longest standing uninterrupted presidential powers. And my only point here is that, yes, we can object to that in terms of you should declare declare war on all of these. Congress has said it doesn't want to do that. Congress passes resolutions and it has not taken efforts to block presidents in this regard. So if we return to the question of whether Trump has the legal authority to take out ships coming out of Venezuela loaded with drugs because he says that this is a terrorist operation, you bet he does, unless you want to make that cat walk backwards by about 180 years.
So I want to answer the first question, and then I do want to circle back on one thing. So I think, just look at any public opinion poll. People despise Congress, right? Congress is less popular than like the plague, right? It's extremely unpopular. And I think that one of the structural problems, and again, this doesn't begin in this moment, but the problem with Congress being structurally disempowered, maybe the last couple decades, is that in a moment when we need checks and balances, Congress is not there. In a moment when you might be concerned about judicial overreach, maybe you're concerned about judicial overreach, maybe you're concerned about executive overreach, maybe you're concerned about Biden's executive overreach, maybe you're concerned about Obama's executive overreach, but maybe you're concerned about Trump's executive overreach. Congress is not empowered. Basically, all Congress has done, it passes big bills that go through the reconciliation process to avoid the filibuster, and occasionally passes other kinds of legislation, but is largely speaking inert. And that's why I gave the example of the Department of War, not because that is a sign of a constitutional crisis, but it's a sign of how inert Congress is. And everybody knows it's inert. You all know that if you wanted Congress to pass a law fixing the immigration problem in this country, it's like a joke, right? How would they ever do that? That's not even possible to imagine. And if that's true, and Congress, and Article 1 is the first and longest and most detailed and most Madisonian article in the Constitution, I think that should give us some pause about how much faith we have in our constitutional structure to do the work that we're asking of it, if Congress itself, everybody knows, is disempowered. And let me just say one more thing about the Venezuelan vote. It's just because, in general, the reason why we have accepted this kind of practice for a long time is a kind of deep faith in military intelligence, a deep faith in a kind of public-minded military intelligence. And I just want to report to you, even if everybody in this room retains that deep faith in military intelligence, this is a report from my, kombucha drinking northeastern corner of the universe, that faith doesn't exist anymore because of so much of what we're seeing in the actual actions of this administration. Without that faith, these actions become much more problematic, because once you start saying, we trust you that these were terrorists, well, then it's a certain kind of thing. But if you say, and there's been reporting, the woman said that guy was a fisherman, not a drug dealer. Once that faith is undermined, it becomes a much more problematic thing. You can have the factual dispute as much as you want, but once that faith is undermined, those become much more problematic things that continue to undermine the faith, the underlying trust that is part of what makes the machine churn. And when that trust is gone, the machine doesn't seem as justified anymore.
Professor Shirley, I want to let you respond, but I also have a specific audience question for you to answer as well. If we are not in a constitutional crisis presently, what event or events do you believe would need to occur for our country to cross that threshold?
Let me answer that, but I'm going to first respond to two things that were stated. One is, first of all, the objection to taking out that vote on a policy question has nothing to do with a constitutional crisis. It has to do with the policy. The question is, does he have authority to do what he did? You can disagree with the use of that authority, but it is not a constitutional crisis to say, I don't think he should be taking votes out, and you may convince me of that point. But I want to note something about Congress. I've spent most of my life working with Congress. I even represented the House of Representatives for a while in one case. Here's the fact that in a democratic system, when a nation is divided, you get less done. That's democracy. We're a divided nation. We are divided right down the middle. And yes, that means Congress is divided and they can't agree on anything. You can't agree on anything with your neighbors because we are divided. We've gone through these periods before. And when we are divided, we do less until we get some type of consensus. That's called democracy. It's not proof that the system is failing. It's proof that there is still a democratic element in there. Now, in terms of when would we have a crisis, it would require the failure of the tripartite system. I don't consider Congress to be a failure of the system. I've been very critical. I want them to be more active. It's not a failure of the system. And even though I've been critical of lower court judges in some respects, I don't consider it a failure of the system. They render their decisions, they've been reversed, and that's how the system works. Where you have a serious, the closest, as I've said, to a constitutional crisis, in my view, is probably Lincoln and habeas corpus. That was where the Supreme Court made it very clear that, as is obvious, that the president could not unilaterally take that step. It ended up getting sort of bundled up with the events at that time. It seemed like the president and the Supreme Court were going to come to loggerheads, and they did not. But that could be a crisis when the president asserts that sweeping authority over the great risk and does so in defiance of the courts. I think that's probably the closest we have gotten to. The major crises that we have faced didn't come close to a true constitutional crisis. You know, the Nixon crisis, when he defied courts, it didn't even raise the EKG on our system. It was not a big problem. The courts told him, yes, you are going to comply with these orders, and he did. And so I think that what we have is a time-tested system that for all of the complaints that you have about the outcome and maybe the policies, the system actually has proven itself. It has been really stress tested over and over again. That's why Madison said that if all men were angels, no government would be necessary. The inverse of that is that the test of a good system is whether you could be totally devils. And God knows our leaders have tested that principle over and over again, and he has been proven correct.
Professor Bergman, here's a question for you. You mentioned that the fact that our Constitution has had to be amended and changed is maybe a symptom of a greater constitutional crisis. So if we are in one presently, how should the Constitution be changed to meet this moment?
That's a great question. So I just think one way of thinking about this, and this is just a difference, I think, in the definition that we're using. And as I said at the beginning, it may be not a particularly interesting thing to fight about that definition. You might be drawn to one definition or another. To me, we've had many moments of profound instability, political instability, that were not resolved by the Constitution as it existed at that moment. Maybe not many, but I can just give you a couple examples. So the paradigmatic one is the example of the Reconstruction Amendments. Yes, were they amendments to the Constitution? Absolutely. It's also the case, and this is maybe arguing against interest, that the 14th Amendment was passed at gunpoint. It was an armistice. It's problematic in terms of its actual structure as an amendment. It fundamentally altered the shape of the Constitution. It fundamentally changed the meaning of the entire Constitution. To add equal protection to the Constitution brought in the Declaration of Independence where it had not been. It's hard to overstate how much of a fundamental shift in all of constitutional thinking the Reconstruction Amendments represent. Can make a similar argument about the New Deal. So there were no constitutional amendments during the New Deal, but there was a deep and extremely tense fight in American politics and American civic culture about what powers Congress and the federal government would have in the face of an economic crisis and a looming world war. And what changed was an absolutely fundamental change in the understanding of federal power. A fundamental change that was the court changing its mind. Now, if you want to say that's not a constitutional crisis because our system worked, okay. What I want to say is that in that moment, you had a system where the Constitution was not adequate, was not up to the task. And it had to be shifted. Our understanding of it had to be shifted. I can make the same argument to you about the Civil Rights era, about what people call the Second Reconstruction in the 1960s. There was a Jim Crow system in this country. It was well established, not just in the South, but all over the country, there were Jim Crow laws. Those laws could not be changed just by normal politics, because there were deep structural disagreements. And so a change in our understanding of how the constitutional order worked, what state power meant, and how it related to federal power had to happen. Now, if you want to argue to me that those weren't constitutional crises, they were just political crises, okay. But I will argue to you, and I can show you case by case, how our fundamental understandings of the Constitution changed in responses to those crises. My argument to you is that this is one such moment, perhaps even more striking than either the New Deal or the Civil Rights era. It feels a lot more like the 1850s to me. And if it is one such moment, maybe the Constitution, when we look back on it, will seem to have survived. But I can guarantee you that it will also seem to have changed. And if that's true, then that seems to me to be what we would call a constitutional crisis, at least on my definition.
But
So
can I-
are there specific reforms that?
Oh, yeah, sorry. So I would, yes, I think there are. I think there absolutely are. I think that there is a real, I think that one concrete reform is protection of voting rights. The right to vote is actually not a federally protected right. And that's something that I think could be changed and would have a big impact on a lot of the problems that we're dealing with. I think that there are explicit ways of sort of codifying some of the norms around the limitations on executive power that have developed as norms but were not codified. I don't actually think that those need to be amendments, though. As I've argued to you already, I think those changes can happen in interpretation. They can happen in constitutional culture. And I think that we will see those. It's hard to predict exactly what they'll be because they have to be done together. But I do think we will see them. And I think that they need not be amendments, though they could.
By the way, someone in the audience would like you to know that the Red Sox are up 2-1. Another question for you both. Are sanctuary cities exercising constitutional rights, or are they defying federal supremacy? Professor Turley?
Let me answer that, but I'm going to hijack it so I can respond to my friend. Here's the disconnect. You say the Constitution is failing, and we have to sometimes change the Constitution. The Constitution is not up to the moment. But when you're asked to suggest something of how we change the constitutional system, your answer is a bill to increase protection of voting rights. And by the way, I do not agree that you can codify limits on executive power unless the Supreme Court has already said that those are limits, because Congress cannot just pass restrictions on executive power unless they've already been established. And if they have been established, then why are you passing legislation? But the most important thing about this is that you say, and you signed the letter in March, and I respect that you had good reason to do that, saying we are in a constitutional crisis. And in that letter, you and your colleagues said we don't need a king in Donald Trump. And I certainly agree we don't need a king, but we have a system that has been functioning to pull back the president when he goes too far, support the president when he has the authority to do what he has done. But the problem is that we hear this rhetoric. We're in a constitutional crisis. The crisis is failing right now. It's not doing what we want it to do. And when you're asked, all right, how would you change the Constitution? Your answer is, we could have another Voting Rights Act. Well, that's part of the constitutional process. That's part of the legislative process. And if Congress agrees, if we can come together as a divided nation, it'll pass. And if we remain divided, it won't. Now, in terms of sanctuary cities, cities have a perfectly good right to declare themselves sanctuary cities. In my view, the federal government has a right not to fund that. That the position of the administration is that sanctuary cities are driving this problem further in terms of costs and dealing with the problem. They have been a magnet for undocumented persons entering the country. You can disagree with that or not. The real legal question is, to what extent must the federal government fund a city that they believe is undermining federal immigration law? I think that question has sort of two sort of beacons for navigation. One is, I think that clearly the executive branch should have some ability to say, we're not going to keep supporting you in areas if you're undermining federal enforcement. that there's consequences. Now, at the same time, they can't, under existing precedent, they can't take away so much federal funding that it constitutes what's called commandeering. So the Supreme Court has said, look, you can't just deny all funds just to make cities and states extensions of the federal government to commandeer them. So there are limits there. But I do believe that there's probably more authority than it has been used in the past for the federal government to say, if you are going to be undermining federal enforcement systems, the federal government does not have to fund certain areas that are related to those policies.
So I'll respond to the last thing and then just say one more. I think it's relatively straightforward under the court's current jurisprudence that basically any conditioning of funding on basically saying if you get rid of your sanctuary policy, if you don't get rid of your sanctuary policy, we will defund you. The court has been extremely stringent on the connection between funding threats and policy threats. This is part of why states were not forced to actually abide by the Medicare mandate, the Medicaid mandate in the Obamacare decision back decades ago. I think the broader point, though, is we have a long tradition in this country of local control over local issues of public safety. And I think most of us, if we had an intuition, think about your hometown. I teach local government, right? So think about your hometown. Who do you trust to figure out how complex issues of housing, policing, social welfare, public services should be distributed? Do you trust your local town? Now, I imagine you have some lousy people in your local government. I certainly do. Or do you trust the federal government? This is the core argument of so much of traditional conservatism, is that we don't trust the federal government to make these decisions for us. What are sanctuary cities? Well, they're people saying, we understand our community. We understand how people in our community interact. We understand our local economy. We understand the pluses and minuses of certain kinds of things. They're not saying that, by the way, they don't. There have been no instances up till now, although we may start seeing them, of local police standing in front of ICE officers saying, you may not do this. There's some extremely rare instances of this. Largely speaking, they're just saying, we won't cooperate. And I think that's actually a pretty legitimate and longstanding and deeply American idea, that local governments get to decide when they do and don't cooperate. So it is both a matter of doctrine, not the anti-commandeering doctrine, and also a matter of sort of deep constitutional vibes about whether this is the right kind of thing to do or not. I guess I'll leave it there. I'm gonna go back into the last conversation, and I'm just gonna be happy the Red Sox are winning.
Professor Turley, this is a specific question for you, though. Professor, feel free to chime in afterwards as well. You've mentioned that the political stability that we've experienced over the past, almost 250 years is a sign that the Constitution is working. But, as the professor mentioned, sometimes this is leading to stagnation. The idea that we can't pass immigration reform, for example, because lawmakers simply won't do their jobs. Is stagnation not a symptom that something is not right with our system?
No. First of all, there's a temptation to assign a failure to a system that's not doing what you want it to do. If you have a 5-alarm fire, you don't condemn the fire department. You don't say the fire department's failing. Fire department doesn't actually prevent fires, it puts them out. A constitution does the same thing. It tends to put out fires, and it sometimes doesn't do it as fast as you might want, but it puts them out. Now, the same thing is true with regard to Congress. You can't say that you believe in democracy and you're fighting for democracy, and then say, but we're not happy the fact that Congress is divided and they can't agree on anything. What's your solution? We're a nation divided. We've been here before. And during those times, we don't get much done. We have to talk to each other. We have to convince each other. Times and conditions change. And then we eventually seem to find a way to reach a consensus. That's called democracy. But all of them are saying, look, it can't work this way. Congress is obviously failing because it can't come together on legislation. that is a reflection of who we are, where we are in this moment. And yes, that includes a possible shutdown today. There have been 10 shutdowns before this one. And it is the most extreme form of dysfunctional disagreement in Congress. It is a lethal, but American politics is a lethal game. And it is not for the weak of stomach. But I still am left with this question of what is your solution? Is your solution to say we have to get beyond our divisions, and so we'll just have to make the decision, force the decision? Who makes the decision? How do they make the decision? So if you believe in democracy, you're stuck with it, pal. I mean, this is the ugly part of democracy, and it's a reflection of who we are. The good news is we've been here before, and we have come together as a country. It just takes a while.
I'll just respond quickly. I think the fire department analogy is actually a really rich one. One of the reasons why we all happily cook dinner in our own homes and sometimes use gas stoves in our own homes is that we know there's a background reality that we have a fire department, right? It structures our behavior. The background socials, the background conditions of things like fire departments, things like police departments, things like public schools, structure our behavior, things like Social Security, structure our behavior. When those things disappear, that's the analogy for the Constitution. But when those things no longer feel like something we can trust, that changes our behavior. It changes our fidelity, our faith in what we can do safely, what we trust is available to us if we act. So to make the analogy of what we should do, if we are acting in a world where the fire department is basically out to lunch, and they're like, sorry, it's a fire, and nothing we can do about it, then we have to become volunteer firemen. That's where volunteer fire departments come from, solving a collective action problem. Now, if you want to know what my solution to the problem is, my solution is precisely to push back against the idea that we aren't in a crisis, because that is a demobilizing way of thinking about what we're doing. That way says somebody else will do it. The system will work. But systems don't work magically. Even AI doesn't work magically on its own. Somebody's behind the curtain. In the context of the United States, we are behind the curtain. The Constitution is not a magical text, no matter how brilliant or dweeby James Madison was. It's a thing we do together. And we're not doing it. We have to do it. And the way we do it in these moments is to become mobilized. We become mobilized because we're alarmed. So when we talk about crisis, we're actually talking about becoming mobilized, becoming activated, engaging. And so I'm not sure why we should be afraid of the idea of crisis, because it's actually a call to action. It's a call to join the volunteer fire department, which it feels to me is what we should be doing.
I have to say, first of all, I am worried about coming to dinner at your house if you do cook with the fire department in mind. But it's not a pressing concern with me when I cook. But here's the problem: is yes, this is all participatory politics, but this mantra that it's not working, we have to mobilize. Why? We just mobilized. We had a presidential election. It's just that many people don't like the result. And so they say, it's not working. We have to mobilize. What does mobilize mean? It means that, I want a different result. And brother, I'm with you on that. You want a different result, and you should fight for it, and you should mobilize. That's not a crisis in our system. Everyone's mobilized today. I don't see a problem of mobilization. Everybody is animated. Everybody is angry. Everybody is out there. So they are all mobilized. It's just that they're not mobilizing in the direction that some want. And so, yeah, we have a democratic system and we're a divided country and people are going in different directions. But when you say that we're going to have a volunteer firefighting force, we have a fire department that puts out those fires. I don't understand when you say but it's not working. We're losing faith in it. Why are we losing faith in it? The system is working as it has for over 200 years. The courts are working. We're resolving these questions. It's just the result that many people don't like.
We're going to move into closing statements. So Professor Bergman, if you would like to go first. And before we begin, I would also just like to remind everyone to take the post-debate poll. So if your minds have changed, let us know. You should be able to access that in the QR code that you received.
You want to do them up there or do you want to do them here? Yeah, sure. All right, I'll go to the official spot. Oop, forgot my paper. So I guess I want to close by thinking about a moment in the constitutional crisis that I study a lot, which is in the 1850s. And so I want to tell you a little story about Frederick Douglass. So Frederick Douglass, famous abolitionist, heroic figure in American life, heroic to people on both sides in general. In the 1850s, when the sort of entrenched crisis between slavery and anti-slavery was growing into a national sort of irreconcilable problem, Douglass decided that he wasn't with his friend William Lloyd Garrison, who wanted to burn the Constitution. Instead, Douglass took the Constitution and he read it as an anti-slavery document. Now, you might say this is arguing against my point. Look, Douglass is using the Constitution. It's not a real crisis. Douglass absolutely believed we were in a constitutional crisis. He absolutely believed we were in a mortal moral crisis as a nation. The Constitution was being used to uphold and perpetuate and make worse the problem of slavery. The constitutional order demanded a compromise with slavery. The Supreme Court demanded a compromise with slavery. Dred Scott demanded a compromise with slavery. Douglass was not sanguine about our constitutional order. But in rereading the Constitution as an anti-slavery Constitution, what he did was take the Constitution and give it new meaning to solve the problem that we were facing. Now, if you want to say that this was not a constitutional crisis, okay, then fine. We don't have a disagreement. What I want to say is that we are in a moment like that right now. We are in a moment where we're not just divided. It's not just normal division. We're in a moment when many people in this country feel existential anxiety about whether they are protected by the Constitution. We're in a moment where people like me who live in blue cities worry that there might be federal troops on our streets tomorrow. We're in a moment where people who might look Latino worry that they might be pulled off the street with no warning and with no due process. We're in a moment when people who've relied on federal funding that's been appropriated by Congress can't rely on it. We're in a moment where the president, despite court orders to the contrary, continues to say, well, maybe I'll run in 2028. It's deeply unstable. It's deeply anxious making. I think all of us are probably anxious. So if that's not a constitutional crisis, okay. But what are we going to do in that moment? In that moment, what we have to do is actually work politically. And work politically, I would suggest, in a way that we don't normally work. And that requires us to take ownership of the Constitution. And that can only happen if we recognize that this isn't just normal. This isn't just the way things are. Something is different. My word for that is a crisis. And if something is different, then we have to act together. And that doesn't just mean those of us who agree with each other should act together. And it doesn't, by the way, just mean some of us have preferred policy outcomes and we're not getting them. It doesn't mean we have to dispute the legitimacy of elections. It means that actually we have to go back to those core values that I began with: political stability, democracy, separation of powers, individual rights. To the extent that those things don't feel safe to us right now, that is a crisis. And to the extent that that crisis is real, we need to do something about it. And I think that thing we'll be doing together is constitutional. I think it's constitution making. That's because I actually believe that we're authorized and required to be remaking our Constitution in order for it to be legitimate. Because it is it's a document of self-government. And so if we're not invested in that process, then we're not actually doing it right. So let me just give you a quote by one of my favorite folks, and this is going to locate me geographically. So Henry David Thoreau, writing in the 1850s, had become awakened to the problem of slavery. He becomes radicalized as an abolitionist after a man named Anthony Burns is dragged through the streets at gunpoint, being returned to slavery by the way, by federal troops at gunpoint, being returned to slavery by order of a federal court. And Thoreau wakes up, basically, and he says, it is not an era of repose. We have used up our inherited freedom. If we would save our lives, we must fight for them. And I would suggest to you that it is not an era of repose. And whether you want to call that a constitutional crisis or not, it's incumbent upon us to save our freedoms, to do something about it. If you don't want to call that acting in a constitutional crisis, fine. I hope you'll at least recognize that that's what we have to do together, no matter what you call it.
Well, first of all, I would like to thank thank you, and also to thank my colleague Daniel for this debate. We obviously have serious culinary differences, but we do have some things in common. I'm, of course, speaking to the fact that we both belong to two baseball clubs that were cursed and overcame those curses. And so there may be hope in this, what Daniel was describing as a dark period in our history. I have a book coming out in February called Rage in the Republic. And it looks at part of it's sort of half of it's looking backward, half of it's looking forward for the American democracy on the 250th anniversary of our declaration. And it looks at two cities, a tale of two cities, Philadelphia and Paris. And both were heading to civil war. This was after we prevailed over the British. Philadelphia was experiencing militias in the street. There was a battle called the Battle for Fort Wilson, which occurred outside the home of James Wilson. People died. And then suddenly it ended in Philadelphia. And the only great or significant factor that occurred is the ratification of the United States Constitution. In Paris, it turned into a bloodletting. It turned into the terror, and tens of thousands were guillotined. The difference is that the American Constitution was designed to protect us from ourselves, to protect us from not just tyranny, but what was called democratic despotism, majoritarian tyranny. It limits us. It controls our passions. And so, yes, things like this time occurs, but we have overcome those times. In my book, I talk about how two of the fiercest opponents, Adams and Jefferson, after spending their lives trying to actually kill their opponents, particularly in Adams, at the end of their lives, they came together. And Adams reached out to Jefferson. And what followed was a series of letters that were incredibly profound and incredibly touching. And they renewed their friendship. And they died on the same day. I'm sure you know that. In my book, I talk about a Frenchman. It was called Farmer John. He wrote about the United States to Europeans that were desperately trying to understand the American Revolution. And I talk about one line that he said in those writings, which struck me as incredibly profound. It wasn't a line, it was a question. He said, "What is this American? What is this American?" In Europe, they looked at us like we were a new species. After all, we had nothing in common. We had no culture in common. We had very few languages in common. We came together from different places. And Europe wanted to know, what is this American? He tried to answer that question, but he was also in awe as a Frenchman as to what he was seeing. A new citizen had been born in this world. Our Constitution is more than just an archaic device that establishes the relationship of three branches. It is a covenant for a new citizen, a new people, and it requires a leap of faith. Particularly in a time of rage like we have today. Rage is an amazing thing. It allows you to do things, say things you would not normally say or do. It's contagious and it's addictive, and people like it because they can question institutions and demand radical changes. But I would simply leave you with the same question of Farmer John. What is this American? What are we at this moment? I think we're greater than our times. We're greater than whatever political crisis is in front of us. My colleague says, okay, maybe we're not in a crisis. What do we do now? What we do now is what we've always done. We'll argue with each other. Maybe we'll yell at each other. But eventually we will come together because we will remember that we have so much more in common than we have indifference with each other. What is this American? Look around you. It is this debate. We're not in a crisis. Thank you.
Well, thank you both very much for this great conversation. I believe that we have the results of our.
Oh, I didn't know they were. Yeah.
Okay. So it looks like a majority disagreed with the prompt coming in, and even more continued to disagree. So, Professor Turley, I guess that means that you technically won, although both made very compelling arguments. So we appreciate the great conversation.
Go Cubs.
Bartman is the real winner because I think your Red Sox are still beating my Yankees at the moment, unfortunately. Just a few words real quick on behalf of Steamboat, and then I'll bring out Colonel Gray. Thank you once again to our panelists for this great discussion, and thank you to the VMI Center for Leadership and Ethics for their support in making tonight's debate possible. I would also like to extend a special thanks to the Adolf Coors Foundation and all of our foundation supporters that were shown on the screen tonight for their support of Steamboat Institute's Campus Liberty Tour. If you enjoyed this evening's debate, we ask that you consider making a tax-deductible contribution to Steamboat Institute to help us restore civil debate and dialogue to college campuses all over America. Please visit steamboatinstitute.org to make your donation and to view our 5 upcoming debates. If you can't join us in person, remember that you can always participate virtually in our debates by hosting a watch party on your campus or in your community. You can find more details and sign up at steamboatinstitute.org. Finally, tonight's debate will be available in its entirety on Steamboat Institute's YouTube channel within the next 48 hours or so. We encourage you to share the video with your networks. So those of you watching online, thanks for tuning in. For those of you who are here with us in person tonight, please join us following the program for some refreshments and conversations with our speakers. We hope you enjoyed tonight's debate, and thank you so much for joining us. Colonel Gray?
You were fantastic. Oh, it's fine. That was great. Thank you.
First, ladies and gentlemen, let's give our 2 speakers and our moderator another big thing. Okay, you done good as an audience because I challenged you at the beginning to role model what a civil debate was going to be. And you were all very attentive. You had great questions for our speakers. So before I present something as a token of gratitude to them, I want you to turn to your right and to your left and shake your fellow American's hand. Now it's my great pleasure to give a small token of appreciation, and I think I can bring us all together with this together. So, gentlemen and lady, I'd like to present you with one of the center's ethical compasses. And it's an ethical compass tonight that is going to help guide us to our constitutional North Star. So I think that means we're going to end up in the same place at some time in the future. So thank you again for a great debate tonight. And again, we look forward to talking to you outside at the reception.
Thank you.